Faith in Time, a Warhammer fan-fiction short story. I have dreams. When the woman spoke, the soldiers of the Imperium in the room listened. The room was small, dark, and quiet. It was a specifically chosen room for these specific reconciliations and for these specific stories. Stories that everyone who had been part of the purging of the Xenos planet on the eastern fringe, named Ulicta, but had never spoken more than the accounts of what happened on that world rather than military actions. Here, in this sanctuary of sorts, the veterans of that conflict would meet discreetly and confess their concerns. They all knew the risks they were taking just for thinking of such things, or for even having emotional reactions like these, for it would be considered weakness or heresy, but they did regardless.
"Tell us about these dreams, Trooper,"
the host urged, holding a hand out to her as though passing over her permission.
I know my place in this galaxy. I know who I am and what I represent and what it is that I fight for, but these dreams,
she stammered. Her cracked lips quivered and a sheen of tears coated her brown eyes.
They haunt me.
The listeners nodded. The host once again held out her hand. It was pale and wrapped in bulging veins.
"Please, Trooper, tell us of these dreams," she insisted. "You'll find no judgment here. No accusations of silly things like heresy or blasphemy. You are among friends who suffered the same as you. Some surely more. Have no doubt that we are all here for you, together."
The trooper did a quick scan across the room, eyeing the attendees. She glanced over the solemn faces and stopped at one in particular, the same one that always forced her to look a second time, even though she was terrified of offending him. He was massive, far too bulky to sit on the steel folding chairs encircling the room for all to face each other. He was nearly 9 feet tall, his hair buzzed to the scalp. 2 service studs were buried in the leathery skin of his forehead, and his eyes glistened like the surface of an ocean on a sunny day. His composure was relaxed, but she could not help but feel intimidated by his presence. Primaris Astartes always had this effect on mere mortals like her. The fact that he was here for the same reasons as she was strange enough, but it reassured her and helped her to face her doubts. If a being as stoic in resolve and massive in stature like a space marine could be here, she knew that her feelings weren't unwarranted. She swallowed hard before continuing.
I see their faces. Their sad and confused faces. My dream is the invasion of their small village. Outside the main city we had just laid siege to, my patrol detachment had come upon it. They were unarmed. They were so small and
innocent,
the host asked. She nodded, and a tear rolled down her cheek.
Commissar Starvik ordered us to open fire on them. They didn't know what we were saying. They were confused and intrigued by our presence. Their teacher was holding a few of the ones that were afraid. She was a female. A small child had approached the commissar and offered him a writing tool of some kind and had smiled at him. He just shook his head, then placed his las pistol to his soft blue forehead.
She broke down, and the host rose from her seat and walked across to stand with her. Her head was shrouded in a hood. The rumors amongst the group stated she had been badly injured in the conflict they were all a part of, but her name was never revealed. She had always been referred to as the host. The host pulled a chair beside the distraught soldier and wrapped her sickly arm around her.
"That's all right, child. You did as you were ordered. Did as you were trained in service to the God Emperor of mankind, beloved by all," she said softly.
The young soldier slowly shook her head.
How could he want this? What did those children do to threaten our way of life? What did they do to deserve the annihilation of their own homeworld?
"What they did was exist. They were a taint on all that is good in the Imperium. They provided weapons to our foe and fueled their war machine,"
a woman blurted from the shadows. Heads turned to face the woman.
"They were Xenos filth, and the galaxy is a better place now to be rid of them, and you all know this. If Canoness Diana ever caught wind of this, you'd all be flogged, or worse. We are all here on our own accord to discuss the events of what happened on Ulicta. If you are going to come here to this gathering, your stories will be welcomed. Your threats and accusations can leave with you. You know where the door is, I'm confident, the host said calmly. The woman emerged from the shadows cast over the corner of the room. She was draped in silver power armor, her hair almost as bright as the silver. Her eyes were cold steel, and she clutched her aquila as she spoke. I will, but not before I warn you all that what you are all doing here, this is how the seeds of heresy are sown. Brother Astoran, you of all should know best that these gatherings do not bode well. Are they not unlike the lodges of old during the heresy? You all should be wary, she warned, raising an eyebrow as she glanced over the 30 members of the group. The massive space marine shifted his bulk around to face her.
Sister Melissa, would you not be here if you too had something to say? This is only a place to voice the torment that is buried deep within our hearts.
You're weak, a disgrace to your order. What happened to the mantra your founding chapter would say? You shall know no fear. When is the steel resolve of the 13th now? Or did they not upgrade that part of you when you were made Primaris? She scolded. Her teeth ground against each other. She wanted to say more. They all could see it. But she waved a dismissive hand and started for the door.
Sister Melissa,
the host called out. The Sister of Battle stopped but did not turn.
Can we assume you will respect our wishes of anonymity?
Aye,
but just this once. I will not support these bloody gatherings any longer. Either you cease them now, or do it somewhere no one will discover as easily as I have, she warned.
The door opened, and a cool breeze churned the dusty floor of the old building, and pale luminous bulbs brightened the looks of concerned veterans.
Perhaps we shall conclude for now. I will inform you all of the date of our next gathering, and perhaps location as well, the host said. The members rose and helped put away their chairs and thanked the host before they slowly exited. As they stepped out of the decrepit building, the smell of exhaust and sweat invaded their nostrils. The woman trooper stood beside Astoran and pulled out a bag of tobacco and rolled it with a damp strip of paper. She lit it and took a long drag, then offered it up to the hulking space marine, who casually shook his head and raised a hand in protest.
Suit yourself. This will kill me, you know. Not you, though.
Not much can it? She asked, chuckling. The space marine smiled kindly and looked down at her. Oh, there's plenty of things out there that can. We aren't as invincible as you may think, he said, his voice like a deep, rolling thunder.
Obviously not if you're hanging out with us in dark buildings, talking about our bloody feelings, she said, shaking her head as she pulled another drag. So what do you think of these meetings? Do you agree with Sister Melissa? Do you think we are seeding heresy by talking amongst each other the way we are?
The space marine clenched his massive fists, his knuckles crackling under the strain. He then adjusted his plain white shirt as he searched for a response. As brave as we are all made to be, and as strong as we are not perfect machines. Certainly, we outmatch mortals with ease, no offense.
None taken,
she replied, a cloud of smoke rolling over the space marine's stoic face. But that does not mean we do not have our doubts. We used to be mortals before our transcendence. I remember my family, albeit vaguely. I'm sure they're long dead now, and even though I have been conditioned to know only war and unending conflict, during precious moments of quiet, I think of them. I try to see their faces and remember their names. It's this weakness that plagues us all. Hope, fear, love, and sadness. This is the weapon of chaos and the gateway to heresy. So long as we can bolster our resolve and keep it from consuming us, that is all we need to continue to serve our Imperium. These meetings are just talks. They are just distractions we need to address and dissolve, and I think this is a good way to clear our doubts and flush out our misconceptions on what our end goal is as a people. The trooper had listened so intently and watched his eyes as he did so that her tobacco stick had burned down to her knuckles. You should talk more often. Why do you keep so quiet at all of our gatherings? You could be a bloody chaplain with speeches like that, the trooper explained, tossing the scrap of the stick away. He shook his head as he chuckled. I like to listen. It's a soldier's way, I suppose. What is your name, trooper? Astran asked. looking down at the stocky woman. Liv. Private Liv Strauder. Imperial Guard 160th Detachment of Ofust Minor here, she explained. How long have you been a guard on this shrine world? He asked her. Well, not long since the Olitka engagement. Maybe 2 Terran years? Can't really remember, honestly, she said. The Space Marine nodded and raised his head. Megastructures lined the street as far as he could see. The wet cobblestone slapped under the feet of the priests heading to the great cathedral several hab blocks away near the docking platform. Ofust Minor was a shrine world and home to several billion souls. It was an orderly world, and the main city as St. Sylvana's stronghold was run as efficiently as any other. The iron resolve of the sororitas left no room for miscreants or criminals on these streets. It was also the main docking station for the transfer of prisoners from the black ships, transporting heretic psychers and rogue or chaos space marines. It was the final stop in the eastern fringe before heading back to Terra, for them to be sacrificed in the Emperor's name. It was here where they would refuel, resupply, and rearm if necessary. There was a stringent order to things, and security was as tight as it could be. There was no room for untrained or incompetent individuals here. This was why having the gatherings once a month was so dangerous. As innocent as it may have seemed, any form of self-doubt in one's loyalties or doubts in a superior's orders could be punishable by death. The Adepta Sororitas, whom of which ran the majority of the operations on Ofust Minor here, were not lenient by any means. Everyone did their part. There was no choice where this line of work was concerned. Asteran eyed the streets, looking for someone. She was supposed to be at the gathering, but as of 2 weeks ago she had been assigned with training a squad of fresh recruits. Novitiates, the sisters named them. His friend had a sister that she was training as part of the group. She hadn't been overly keen on the reassignment, but considering her past warnings from her superiors and the Order's canoness, she should have counted herself lucky. She had been warned several times, asking thought-provoking questions about loyalties, orders, and ways of thinking among the Order. In fact, it was she who had started the group in the first place. It was her detachment of sororitas that had the auxiliary detachment of the 160th with Private Liv attached to it. Asteran was also the support squad that supported the detachment. They had been part of the conflict together from the beginning, through to its brutal end. The sororita he was friends with, and who had started the weekly gatherings, was Sister Superior Anne. Her friends, with Asteran included, had called her Annie. After the conflict and the swift genocide of the Tau on Olicta, Annie had confided in Asteran. Her spirit had been broken, and she had voiced her concerns for what they had done to that world. The canoness almost executed her the moment the concerns had left her lips.
Are you sympathizing for these Xenos scum? Please, Sister Superior, don't tell me I'm hearing whispers of heresy in your words, she had said in front of her squad.
No heresy, Canoness, only concern.
Word it however you like. It means the same in the end. Due to your remarkable history in the Order and with your successful, if not exemplary abilities on multiple missions, I will grant you the chance no one else could ever hope to receive. Thank your past for it shall never happen again. I'm going to pretend that you did not say a single blasphemous word to me. In fact, I will pretend you didn't even approach me at all. Is that understood? Acknowledge me with a nod, then get out of my sight immediately. Or speak again, and I'll exorcise your demonic thoughts from your very skull with my infernal pistol, the canoness raved. Annie had searched the faces of her friends, begging for support, his own included, but none came. Her eyes were hot with fury and embarrassment, but she looked back at the canoness, clenched her jaw, and nodded. Thank the Emperor. Now finish up with the outlying villages. More of these blue abominations hide in every corner. We must be vigilant in the purge of these foul creatures. By flame and melter we will get it done. Sister Anne, we will speak more once we are back on Ofust Minor. And by Celestine, I better not hear another word of treachery from you or your cohorts. Is that clear? The old woman growled.
Aye, Canoness, your will is done. Thank you.
The canoness had thrown up her silver gauntlet and cringed her face. It was a truly disgraceful display of repulsion, and Asteran remembered feeling great pity for poor Anne.
Get out of my sight,
she said, her eyes sealed and a scowl stretched across her weathered face. Anne had nodded and turned away, walking past him and his battle brothers.
There's no room for doubt. How did she think this would go?
his friend Matthias commented through their shared vox. True enough. She is human, though, he replied, not moving an inch as he did. They stood in their battle plate at attention, their kill team consisting of 30 Astartes of the Night Owls subchapter. They were a small subchapter of the Ultramarines, resolving in wisdom and information, much like their founding avenging father. However, where they lacked practicals and theoreticals, they dealt in absolutes and uncanny reconnaissance. They were a chapter that knew the enemy's moves before even they themselves had.
Humans are weak, no matter if they derive from the teaching and training of the ecclesiarchy. I'm surprised not more of them have fallen to such doubts in our eternal mission. I know she's your friend, brother, but you must understand these mere flesh and blood mortals will never match the efficiency of our great legions, he said, his velvety navy blue-colored helmet twitching slightly in Astran's direction. I do, but I also pity them. They do not have the same advantages as we do either. The vast enemies of this galaxy are horrifying beyond imagining. We, at least, are augmented to deal with such things, and even our lost brothers were not strong enough to keep from falling to the darkness. Now place yourself in their boots, brother. Imagine being just a man or woman facing the horrors we have faced, the demons, the Xenos, the heretics. How many sisters of battle have you known to have fallen to such things? How many? Matthias chuckled. You really are fond of these missionaries, aren't you? Particularly that superior. Are you sure you're in the right chapter, brother? I feel like you might be a long-lost son of Vulcan the way you praise and care for these people.
Now, standing in the cold streets of St. Sylvana's stronghold, Astran saw his friend approaching. She ran toward him and Private Liv. Large transports and thunderhawks roared overhead in anticipation of the incoming shipment of prisoners coming from the black ships in the orbital station above Ophust Minor. Sister Anne, or Annie, rather, had maglocked her helmet to her hip. Her eyes glittered from the strings of lumens lining the cables for each light post along the wet, busy streets. She had a smile that pleased him every time he saw it. He wondered if this is what it felt like to have some semblance of a family. He felt a paternal emotion when he was in her presence, although he knew he should not. Attachment was not normally a trait that could be found in a battle-hardened Astartes Marine.
Astran? Liv? Did I miss it? Am I too late? The young superior questioned as she came upon her two friends.
Afraid so.
That Seraphim trooper, Melissa, made a real stink of things, and we all ducked out early, I'm afraid.
You haven't missed much, Liv said, preparing yet another cig.
Oh, I'm sure I did. I missed you two, that much is certain. I was caught up reciting litanies with the novitiates. It's strange to think I used to be one of them, years ago, she recollected, looking up to Astran.
And now look at you, the pride of your order, Astran commended, placing a large hand on Annie's polished silver pauldron. Her armor was immaculate. If there was one thing Astran could say about his friend, it was that she was dedicated to her appearance being immaculate and her equipment just as much. She gave him a soft smile, the smile he adored.
If you say so. I swear if I have to collect another novitiate when she recites a psalm from the book of St. Lucius one more time, I'll turn myself into the repentance superior, for I'll have lost my bloody mind, she said sarcastically. Suppose I should be careful saying such things.
Astran huffed. I'm sure you are no different. Besides, you and your sisters of battle have so many books to memorize, I fear I would miss a verse or two myself, he said. The trio laughed together. It was nice to have these small moments of peace. As much as every other Space Marine craved battle, Astran appreciated these moments of bonding just as much as the rush of battle. He supposed he enjoyed it so much because he had never had the opportunity to do so in the past millennia.
Well, you two, I'd love to stand around under the red skies of our lovely moon world here, but I'm sure Commissar Starvik is wondering where I am so he can bite my head off for something. I'll see you next gathering then, Liv said, ashing out the half remainder of her tobacco stick and her olive green chest armor. Aye, I'll see you then. Take care of yourself, Anne said.
Liv gave a salute and jogged away. Astran regarded Anne. She looked weary. The canoness had her keeping busy all hours of the day and most nights in preparation for the transfer of the black ship's prisoners, scheduled to dock at the orbital platform, hovering ominously above the moon's thin atmosphere. The massive red volcanic planet that consumed the rest of the sky above them roiled from the plumes of sulfuric gases and black hurricanes plaguing the surface. The planet was a desolate, lifeless place, but had been of significant strategic value for the Imperium, being so close to the eastern fringe and making it a great cover to hide the Mechanicum forges under the igneous surface. The forge world was relatively new and still in production. Things moved swiftly, and not just the Imperial war machine, but the industrial machine as well. Mechanicum adepts and their legions of servitors and tech priests, among others, had constant convoys of materials and supplies shipping to the surface of the forge world. It was named, as of a century ago, Proxima 165. An official name had not been summoned as of yet, but the sororitas and Imperial Guard stationed on Proxima's moon aptly named it Doom. It had the appearance to be worthy of the name.
"How have you been, Astran? I feel it's been some time since we last spoke," she said, snapping him out of his deep thoughts.
"I have been well, Annie. And what of you? How is your sister? Syria, was it?" he replied. She smiled and nudged him.
"You know who she is. It's your job to know who is where and what they're all up to at all times. It's the way of your chapter. But yes, Syria it is, and she's transitioning surprisingly well. I'm afraid she might one day soon be a superior, or worse, a canoness. The other novitiates require some attention, but Syria is learning faster than I could have hoped," she confessed.
"Is there a hint of jealousy I hear in your tone, sister?" Astran asked, raising an eyebrow.
"Not jealousy, no. I'm afraid of her resolve. I'm afraid at how devout she might be. She is. Please, don't listen to me. I promised the canoness there'd be no more talk of that."
"Do I look like a canoness to you?" "You can tell me, Annie. You know you can," he said. "Come, let's continue the meeting."
They stepped back into the abandoned Hab building and walked into the corner of the room. Astran pulled out a chair from the stack he had made before he had left earlier and set it down for Anne. He took the liberty to sit on the floor. Anne reluctantly took the seat and let out a long sigh as she searched for the words to speak her mind. "I'm not jealous of Syria. I'm worried about her," she confessed.
"How so?"
Astran asked, placing a fist under his chin to prop his massive head up on his knee. "I'm afraid of her dedication, her blind faith in our Emperor, beloved by all, and I know I shouldn't be, and I know I should share the same resolve as her and my other sisters of the Shroud, but I fear it may cloud her judgment one day. She may have too much faith."
"Is not faith the one thing that you and your sisters use to fuel your strength? Does it not grant you the power of the Emperor's miracles and divine interventions?" Astran asked.
"So I've heard. I mean, we read about them in the holy texts, about the countless battles against chaos and the demons of the warp. We read the stories and listen to the tales from the other orders and how Celestine uses the gift of the Emperor to achieve immortality so she may once again lead us to victory against the dark gods. But I have yet to see it. I have yet to feel his touch and to hear his voice guide me to achieve the greatness I know we are all capable of, but as of yet, I have seen no such signs. I'm afraid that... Throne, I'm not sure how to put this."
"Try, Annie," Astran insisted.
"I'm afraid that either the Emperor has not found a place for me, or has decided that I am not worth his time,
Or? Astran asked.
Or the Emperor's power is just an illusion. All the miracles documented or witnessed in battle might be just stories," she said.
Astran glanced around the room. The air brushed his sleeveless arms as though something passed by him, but there was no sound to be heard. He made sure no one had been eavesdropping, knowing full well that the words coming out of Anne's mouth was enough for her to be executed without court for saying such things. Astran noticed a tear pierce the veil of her eyes. He knew she did not want to think this way. He knew she hated herself for doubting her faith. Being a sororita without faith was like a space marine without his armor or his bolter.
"Am I not worthy?" she asked Astran.
She placed her head into her hands and stifled a sob. Astran rose to his feet and walked to her. He took her head and pulled it into his chest. "You are the most worthy woman I know. Most soldiers would not have endured a fraction of the horrors you have if it weren't for their faith. The fact you seem to have lost yours, yet continue to fight unhindered, is a testament to your spirit, Annie. Know that and let that drive you. Perhaps the God Emperor of mankind just hasn't needed to guide you. Perhaps he knows you don't need his help with anything, that you are strong enough to do his holy work on your own, and to inspire those around you, he said.
Well, perhaps my test of faith is still yet to come, she said, pulling her head away and losing herself in Astran's determined eyes.
Perhaps. I'm sure, either way, you do him proud as you do me proud, Annie, he said, brushing a tear from above the tattooed fleur-de-lis on her cheek.
Where did they find you, Astran? How did I get so lucky to have you in my life? She asked.
He smiled. Perhaps it was, for lack of a word, fate, he said. Something moved in the corner of the room. Someone small and frail moved from one shadow to an open door, into another. "Who's there?" Astran called out. Anne turned, her armor creaking as it pinched with the movement of her torso. She saw nothing.
"Vagrant?" she asked.
"Not this close to the cathedral. Could be a group member from the gathering earlier," he suggested, taking a step toward the doorway. He stepped into a cloud of ozonated air, the scent tingling his senses. It was a smell he was all too familiar with. Psychers gave off the scent when they conjured up their magics or used warp energy. There weren't any librarians stationed on Ofest Minor, so this individual was obviously a rogue.
"Come out now, or we will call the guard,"
Anne ordered. The sound of shuffling footsteps broke the silence, and a plume of dust rolled from the doorframe the silhouette had slipped through. A hooded figure stepped out.
"I apologize. I was listening to your conversation and couldn't help myself," she started.
"You're the host," Astran said. She nodded. Her face was concealed under the ocean blue hood.
"What's your name?" Anne asked her.
"You don't know this woman? She has hosted the last 2 gatherings we have had here," he explained.
Anne shook her head.
"I am the host,"
she explained, a golden glint shimmering where her eyes would be beneath the large hood.
"Name."
"Tell it or you will be detained," Anne demanded.
"Then you shall detain me, Sister Superior," she said.
The hooded woman turned and knelt to the ground. She wrapped her hands around her back and prepared herself to be cuffed.
"I am what you fear I am, sister. Arrest me and take me to your prison. I am ready to confess my sins, but only when I am placed in the custody of the Order of the Argent Shroud will I do so," she insisted.
Anne and Astran looked at each other. When they looked back down at the woman, she was gone. Only the strong smell of ozone was left where she had knelt. The back door leading out to the streets crashed open. Sister Melissa entered the room and looked incessantly annoyed.
"Thought you two would be here. The black ship is arriving within the hour. Gather your initiates, Sister Superior, and prepare them for the transfer. You are to assemble on platform 38 in 20 minutes. They will learn firsthand the importance of our duties here. Lord Astran," she said, and gave a curt nod. She turned and headed back out. A rhino transport awaited her outside and ground their tracks as she climbed aboard the back of the large armored vehicle.
"What do we do about the host?"
Anne asked. Astran rubbed his chin. "For now, we fulfill our duty. Once the transfer of prisoners is completed, we will revisit the situation. I will inform the Night Owls of what happened, and we will find her. Until then, we have our duties. Let's go."
Aurora Galantis, we have picked up significant heat signatures on all specs. Has your vessel been damaged? Asked Canoness Ivanka through the Vox system.
Ofast Minor, we have engine trouble and will need repair crews on site upon our arrival. One of our prisoners managed to break free and fled to the engine rooms to overload the plasma reactors in a selfless attempt to destroy the ship. Our Sisters of Silence managed to stop him before he could do any real damage, the stone-cold voice explained.
We have repair crews on standby, Captain. You are cleared to dock on orbital platform 361, the Canoness said.
Astran and his squad of night owls were fitted in their power armor and loomed over the menials, working to guide in escort ships and direct troops and repair personnel to the orbital platform above Ofest Minor. Sister Superior Anne stood at attention with her novitiates, watching and absorbing the goings-on in the command tower next to the landing pad. The Canoness was under close watch of the sacrosancts, halberds planted in the steel-grated flooring and shields held to their chests. They were lined like a barrier, and the red visors scanned the room. No one, save the Space Marines, would ever be allowed closer to the Canoness unless strictly authorized during any form of engagement, meeting, or transfer of prisoners, as they were performing now. They were a viciously well-trained group and among some of the strongest in the Order. Seraphim troops circled the platform outside, and Anne watched them through the thick, glissaic window in the tower. Their superior, adorned with holy braziers on each shoulder burning with bright promethium, made her look majestic. Her jetpack was flared out like an angel's wings, and her polished silver plate armor glistened in the hard firelight of the volcanic planet above. Her plasma pistols' coils burned bright blue in her holster as she gave what seemed to be a rousing speech. There were close to 50 of the Argent Shroud Seraphim and Zephyrim. She had always wondered if she'd have the courage to fly into the heat of a conflict like they did. Their courage was commendable, and she had seen the horror they inflicted on their prey as they descended from the sky and slammed into the fray of their enemies. They had been some of the fiercest fighters she had ever seen, including the powerful Space Marine legions.
"Superior Anne, what are they doing? The Seraphim, I mean," one of the younger novitiates asked. "They are on standby. They will intercept anyone that tries to flee or offer support in the attempt of an escape to whichever forces are needing the support, whether that be engaging aircraft or prisoners on the ground. They act as a quick response unit," Anne explained. "And what of us? What part do we play here?" another of the young aspiring sisters asked. Anne cleared her throat and stood in front of them. They all stiffened and stood at attention. Her sister smiled at her, admiring her status most likely. "We are here to observe and offer any support to those who require it. We are to learn of the procedures and doctrines of how the multiple detachments coordinate with each other to ensure swift and proficient actions." Anne turned and saw that Astran stood beside his friend, Matthias. Astran's teal-green eye lenses glanced at her, and she returned his gaze with a smile. An almost missable nod came from her friend. Matthias turned and gave a quick look to her and her novitiates before returning to the conversation he was having with Astran. "Ophis Minor, there has been a change in plans," the captain of the Aurora Galantis said.
"I'm afraid I misheard you, Captain. Repeat last transmission," the canoness ordered.
"I said, we are coming to you." Anne looked out the window and saw that the Seraphim were looking skyward. One pointed a finger toward the sky. They then suddenly activated their jetpacks, and blue flames jettisoned them straight into the air like hawks leaping from a branch toward its prey. Anne craned her neck to look upward and saw the colossal ship of flame descending at speed towards St. Sylvanus' stronghold. Alarm klaxons chimed warnings, and red warning lumens strobed across the command dais along with other cogitators. The novitiates fell out of formation to take a look themselves. They gasped at the fiery carnage descending upon the stronghold.
"Aurora Galantis, cease descending upon the stronghold immediately. You are to redirect to orbital platform 361, the canoness raged.
Sergeant Solonius of the Night Owls approached the canoness. Anne had not met him personally, but remembered Astran speaking about him on several occasions. He was distant and a strong listener. He knew most things before they seemed to happen.
"Madam Canoness, we have received reports of possible treachery among the ranks," he said.
The canoness glanced around the room at the small platoon of Imperial Guard, whom of which Private Liv was attached to, then the Night Owl Space Marines, the countless communique officers, then finally over to the novitiates.
"What do you know?" she asked. "Do you know who?"
Several of the hulking Space Marines stepped out of their formation and drew their bolters. Anne felt her stomach lurch at the sight. She tried to process what it was that was happening, and the sheer shock on the canoness's face told her something was wrong. The 5 Space Marines left in the center of their ranks looked at the others that surrounded them with their bolt guns drawn.
"Matthias, what is this?"
Astran asked his friend. Matthias had his massive weapon trained on Astran.
"There is a change of plans, like our brother on the Vox just said," he informed.
Astran clenched his fists. On the command floor by the dais, Anne saw the Space Marine sergeant place a hand on the back of the canoness's neck. She gasped as he squeezed his armored fingers together.
Who are you?"
she asked. The workers by the command terminals froze in fear and confusion. The Imperial Guard and sacrosancts did not have time to react due to the mass confusion of what was happening.
"I am Alfarius," he said.
Astran turned to Anne.
"Run!"
he shouted. Matthias fired his bolter, and Astran's head exploded in a flurry of metal shrapnel and bone, showering his brain matter and blood over the other Marines beside him. Astran's massive bulk crashed to the ground in a heap of metal, the servos in his power armor whining to compensate for the sudden fall. The sergeant closed his fingers, snapping the canoness's spine, then twisted his wrist to completely dislocate her head from her shoulders and shoved her corpse face down the stairs leading up to the Strategium. The rest of the Space Marines cut down their brothers in a quick, vicious burst of bolter fire. Anne turned to the novitiates. The traitor sergeant drew his blue power sword, and crackles of electric power snapped around the razor-sharp edge of the blade. He swung the blade at the sacrosancts, who used their shields as a defense. Some had turned to face the sergeant, while some of the others charged at the traitors who had cut down their battle brothers. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but this did not change their resolve. "For Celestine!" the sacrosanct superiors screamed. One halberd pierced the weak spot of one traitor marine in the neck sleeve. A gout of blood spurted over her bronze shield, and as she retracted her blade, she swung her shield back and clenched in her hand through a groove in the shield. She fired her plasma pistol. The hot plasma blast shattered the Space Marine's visor and exited the back of his helmet, steam and blood boiling from the wound. The other Space Marines quickly turned their guns on the brave warriors and opened fire. Their shields were strong, but the sheer number and concussive detonations of the rounds broke through and pulped the sisters into bloody rags and piles of broken bones and gore. One of the last sacrosancts held up a rosary above her, chanting a litany, calling the Emperor for his help. She was silenced with the heel of a reinforced armor-plated boot crushing her fragile head into the floor.
"Head for the cathedral! Now!"
Anne screamed at the novitiates. She led them from behind toward the exit, bolter fire screaming from behind them. She heard the screams of the Imperial Guard being cut down by bolter fire and the communique. She removed her bolt pistol from her harness and prepared herself to use it. Her chest was on fire from the pain of seeing her longtime friend being suddenly executed before her very eyes. And as much as she despised her canoness, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming dread of losing her commander. And with the sacrosancts butchered, she would be the next in line of command. "Stop them!" the traitor sergeant demanded. Before they could, Anne was already firing her pistol as she backed out the command tower door, ensuring the novitiates escaped. Her bolt rounds clanged as they ricocheted off the armored pauldrons of the traitor Space Marines, but it was enough to make them move into cover. As she backed her way outside, the sky sounded like it was on fire. The loud rumbling of the engines of the black ships entering the thin atmosphere of Ophis Prime made Anne look up. She saw the cloud of fire and steel that was the black ship that fell toward them. Space Marine Thunderhawks escorted it on the way down, along with the squads of Seraphim and Zephyrim. Anne squeezed the switch on her Vox.
"This is Sister Superior Anne of the Argent Shroud. We have been betrayed. All units stationed in St. Sylvanus stronghold. The canoness has been executed by insurgents, posing as Night Owl Space Marines. None can be trusted. Be wary, and may the Emperor guide you in this trying time."
Anne and the novitiates descended the stairs along the tower to the streets. There was a thunderous howl from above. She risked a look again and saw streams of fire cascading down to the streets. Loud booms and crashes echoed through the streets, and the citizens and high priests screamed in terror at the carnage raining down upon them. How? She asked herself. How could this have happened? Ophis Minor was a shrine world protected by the power of the Emperor and his angels. How could the Night Owls have been infiltrated, being the intelligence-gathering perfectionists that they were? And Astran? A sob left Anne's mouth uncontrollably. Her sister Syria helped her to her feet. "Come, sister, we must hurry. The cathedral isn't far. Most of them are coming. The novitiates need you. I need you," she screamed. Anne fought the urge to give up. Her friend was dead. The city was under siege by Chaos Space Marines, and the only defense the city had was butchered in under a minute before her very eyes. It would be months before any reinforcements would arrive, and she knew they would be slaughtered long before then. Hope was fading fast. She needed to get to the cathedral and take shelter there. Perhaps other survivors would think the same. They needed to make it across 2 hab blocks to get there. A sudden and deafening howl sound blazed over them like a fireball streaking the sky. Anne soon realized that the streams of fire she saw earlier were drop pods. In high orbit, massive ships were hovering ominously, and white flashes of explosions cracked the sky as the orbital station, hundreds of kilometers above, took heavy damage from torpedoes and devastating las bolts. Anne got to her feet with the help of her sister. "The Emperor protects," her younger sisters told her. She certainly hoped so. They sprinted their way through the aimless mob of citizens and nobles seeking shelter from the continuous blasts overhead and thundering collisions of drop pods landing on the megastructures or plowing their way through them into the alleyways. A Storm Eagle gunship outfitted with ocean blue colored plates and twin heavy bolters and Hellstrike missile launchers soared over them, then dumped a backwash of heat as it spun 180 degrees to hover directly in front of them. Through the large glissaic cockpit, Anne could see the pilot, a space marine wearing the heraldry of the Hydra. The heavy bolters honed in on the novitiates and were about to fire. Beneath the gunship, a squad of marines dropped onto the street, carrying stalker bolters, a far more accurate alternative to the bolt guns their other chapter brothers carried. They knelt and poised their weapons at them. The novitiates had fallen back behind a citizen's truck and took some cover in the hab building beside them. It would make no difference. The Storm Eagle gunship would obliterate everything on the street in one salvo. Anne knew there was nothing she could do. There was not a place she could go. It was the perfect ambush, the perfect slaughter, and no one had seen it coming. Before Anne had accepted her fate, she decided to try and ask one last time for aid from the master of mankind. Just one intervention, just enough so that the novitiates and her sister may live. She took the rosarius around her neck and held it close to her chest and was about to close her eyes, but before she did, a resounding boom was heard overhead as silver angels rushed over top of them and straight toward the gunship. The Alpha Legion Marine redirected their weapons upward and began to fire. The angels of death were far too swift to be plucked from the sky, and as they drew near the enemies, half of the flock of Zephyrim dove toward the legionaries on the street, power swords crackling and bolt pistols snapping off rounds into them. The other Seraphim landed atop the Storm Eagle gunship. One of the Seraphim that Anne recognized to be Melissa had drawn her Inferno pistol and poised it at the pilot through the cockpit window and fired. An explosion of metal and glass erupted from the aircraft, and the Storm Eagle gunship began unleashing its payload as it went down. The pilot must have held the fire mechanism in his death throes. Rows of missiles whistled across the street into the buildings around the sororitas, and they dodged tumbling debris of rockcrete and melted steel girders and bodies caught in the crossfire.
"Sisters, quickly, to the cathedral! Run, and don't look back!" Anne ordered.
The Zephyrim managed to kill several of the Space Marines with swift jabs of their power swords. With each stab, they activated their jump packs and dodged counter blows from the Marines. When one Zephyrim pulled back, another charged in her place so as to send a continuous charge into the traitorous legionaries. It worked the first couple of times, but the Space Marines had seen most forms of fighting, and this time drew combat knives and parried the sisters coming down. One Marine grabbed the sororita's wrist and hacked off her hand in a single blow, then crushed her head with the butt of his own helmet. They started to step back over their fallen brothers and take calculated shots into the flock of silver angels, and gradually the sisters started falling from the sky. Bright hot beams of plasma from the Superior's pistol burned glistening red holes into the Marine's armor, and two more went down. However, the continued firing of the pistol had overheated, and the Superior was so lost in her rage and the heat of the battle that she did not notice, and an eruption of light and blood and body parts showered the streets below as it exploded in her hand. The Storm Eagle gunship had unleashed its weapons into the surrounding buildings before burying itself in a church on the corner of the block in front of the novitiates. A landslide of rockcrete and pillars rolled onto the cobblestone, and fleeing citizens caught under the tidal wave of debris. Shortly afterward, a massive explosion decimated what was left of the building and the street lumens surrounding it. The Seraphim squad seemed unscathed from the assault and landed in front of Anne and her sisters.
"We will try to cover you and the recruits. We shall meet you at St. Sylvanus Cathedral. Make haste, sister, and get these girls to safety, and make safe the relics in the Holy Armory," Melissa ordered, raising her infernal pistol. The other Seraphim were now pulling out their hand flamers and checking the promethium tanks attached to the undersides. They activated the gas release and sparked the barrel's igniters. A jet of blue flame purred from the nozzles on the tips of their flamers. "Purge the heretics!" they screamed, and went to support their Zephyrim sisters on the street. The cathedral was gargantuan. Adorned in statues of the fallen saints and pillars of gold, the sisters quickly made their way up the 100 steps to the holy doors. Once inside, they closed them. The nave was so high that for a normal citizen to bear witness would instill instant vertigo and a feeling of insignificance.
Even though Anne had been here on countless occasions, it still bewildered her. The raw human drive to build and erect such a gargantuan structure in such a short period of time would often force her to reevaluate her significance in the grand schemes of the universe. But times of deep consideration and thought would not do any good for her at this point. There were thousands of people taking shelter in the building. Several squads of Imperial Guards stood near the entrance and were ordering the civilians to take cover in the lower catacombs. The entrance to the underground halls was jammed with panicking bodies. Dust rolled from the supports of multiple crossbeams and chain-suspended braziers. Cherubs with their death masks hovered ominously above the people carrying censers, and parchment dabbled in ancient litanies of faith. "Annie!" a familiar voice had called out. Anne turned to the direction of the voice, hope slowly flowing back into her shaking soul. It was Liv. She waved to her, and Anne could see she was relieved to see her and her sisters as well. The novitiates were holding back the citizens who came to them begging for protection and guidance. Even as novitiates, the people still viewed them as a beacon of light in the darkness. The novitiates were probably more afraid than those who sought their protection.
"What an ass-backwards day this turned out to be. I'm glad you made it out of that bloodbath at the tower," Liv said. "I still can't believe Astran."
She trailed off, and her eyes rolled to the floor. The white of Liv's eyes slowly formed a red tinge as tears began to pool.
"Our time for grieving will have to come later, my friend. For now, we must find a way to secure this building and make safe the relics of the armory. That is the sacred duty I have been given by Sister Melissa."
Liv let out a sigh and nodded. A gravelly voice screamed over the frantic crowds. "Private Liv, fall in now or I'll have you shot." Commissar Starvik loomed over the squads of scattered troops under his command, his stature tall and slender. A thick brown mustache curled over his grimacing features.
"Yes, sir. Right away. Good luck, Annie. The Emperor protects," she said, taking hold of Anne's wrists and then giving them a reassuring squeeze.
Liv ran through the mindless masses back to her squad, and Anne watched as Starvik swung his hand around the room, issuing orders. The troopers kept their eyes locked on him in fear and attention. When he was done, the men and women of the Militarum began removing pews and other materials and began boarding up the doors. The crowd was herded further to the back of the cathedral near the underground entrance. The underground entrance was where the armory containing their holy relics and texts lay. The stained glassaic windows above exploded and rained sharp debris into the crowds. The backwash of turbines and heat of battle outside filled the massive hall as the surviving Sephram and Zephyrim sisters slowly descended like a flock of holy angels. They landed. Some had gashes in their armor, blood-soaked robes under their now dulled silver armor, and one of them had a gaping red hole where her eye used to be. Sister Melissa looked no better. She had a look of pain and defeat, but was using every fiber of her being to remain authoritative and unhindered. "Sisters, refuel and rearm. The traitors make their way here. This is where we shall stand. Our allies will not be here to support us for some time, so it is our solemn duty to protect this shrine and to die if need be. In his name," Melissa said, drawing a power sword from the leather sheath on her bleeding hip. "Sister Anne, make all haste to the catacombs and do everything it takes to ensure those bastards don't get their traitorous hands on our prized possessions. In their hands, it could change the fate of this unending war. Emperor guide you," she said. Anne felt her stomach turn. From a quick glance, the combined might of the Sororitas' fast response team was only 10. The Militarum unit was maybe around 100 or less. There was no telling how many Chaos worshippers there were laying siege to their shrine city. She knew she would not dwell on such things, but it was difficult not to. Anne turned to Syria. She was talking with the other novitiates, reprising litanies of faith and bolstering their resolve. They needed it.
"Syria, sisters, we make for the catacombs. Forcefully remove any and all in our way. Draw your weapons and follow me," she ordered.
There was an earth-shattering explosion that rocked the megastructure, and large blocks of rockcrete fell from the roof. Anne pushed her sisters back against the wall as a painted block the size of a rhino tank slammed into a crowd of nobles and priests, blood and entrails rushing from under the pressure of the slab. Anne shook a bloated arm from her boot and winced. Another explosion erupted from the front door, and like it wasn't there at all. The door flattened, everything beneath it, troopers and all. Thick, oily smoke rolled into the cathedral, along with 10 silhouettes of hulking proportions. The Seraphim and their cohorts screamed as they charged the front door. A horrifying storm of bolter fire turned the interior of the sanctuary into a meat grinder. Melissa managed to fire off a single shot before her arms and head were blown from her pulped torso. Her body parts showered the crowds below, and her jetpack exploded. What small remains were left inside her ceramite armor. Once the Seraphim and Zephyrim were obliterated, the gunfire stream lowered into the serfs and civilians. The horror of it nearly crippled Anne. Women holding their children seeking refuge, and elderly acolytes, along with everyone else, were blown apart. Flesh was superheated from meltafire and bolter explosions, and bodies were fused together into contorted parodies of their former selves. The screams were drowned out by the gunfire. Anne knew it would be seconds before the guns were trained on her and her novitiates. They were sobbing and cupping their mouths at the horror unfolding before them. Syria was screaming at the sisters, telling them to steady their resolve and to get to the basement below. Anne knew it should have been her issuing the orders, maintaining order, and repelling their fear and doubts. Bright beams of lasbolt fire from the Imperial Guard stationed behind makeshift barricades lit the scene of slaughter and merely chipped the teal-blue paint from the Alpha Legionnaires' ceramite plates. Anne could see Liv aiming down her sights, firing. Men beside her exploded from bolter rounds, puffing like balloons before bursting into gobbets of meat and fountains of streaming blood. She was crying as she fired, the fear so raw and real in her eyes. Anne wanted to go to her friend, but knew her duty was with her sister and the recruits. Gentle hands took her arm.
"Annie, we need to move now. If we stay here, we die,"
her sister's voice called to her, above the deafening carnage. Anne turned to Liv and saw she was being packed like a clay ball into the pew she was using as cover. She was being packed with the mounds of meat and flesh that was left of her entire squad. Anne knew she was doomed. She took in a deep breath. "Liv!" she screamed. Somehow, Liv heard the call and turned her brown-eyed gaze to her. Her skin was crimson red from her squad mates. Anne waved her toward her to come along with them. Liv nodded and made a suicidal dash across the mountains of bodies that littered the nave. The legionaries piled into the entrance and fanned out into the entrance, dispersing the smoke as they moved calculatedly and formed a firing line.
"Anne, we need to go now,"
Syria demanded, almost begging. Another Space Marine stepped into the cathedral, garbed in a different colored plate. He wore a death mask that distended the front in an avian shape. He held a stave in one hand, and his other was naked. Elongated fingers, too long even for an Astartes Marine, twitched and curled as he took in the scene. He turned his helmeted gaze through the opal eyes of the mask to Liv and watched as she awkwardly stumbled over the bodies. Anne watched in terror and anticipation of the Space Marines as they were going to cut her down. But they didn't. They just watched her silently as she finally made it to them. The masked man pointed a gnarled finger in their direction.
"Take them. Alive."
His gargled voice echoed across the now silent church. The legionaries slapped their bolters to their backs and drew combat blades as they marched toward the sisters. With Liv finally by her side, Anne was ready to retreat into the dwellings below with the handful of survivors. Anne knew they retreated to their death, but also knew that the armory was unbreachable once inside. Perhaps they could seek shelter in there and hold out until reinforcements came. If there was food and water, there could be a sliver of hope. However, she knew how poisonous hope could be to the fragile mind of a mortal person. Against odds such as these, hope could make one cling to something that didn't exist and make them forget their duty. She needed to hold on and protect the sacred texts and other relic weapons of the ecclesiarchy. That was her duty, her mission, and only in death did duty end. Liv was in the back of the group of white-robed sisters of the novitiates. She shut the door behind her before descending the plasteel staircase down the underbelly of the gargantuan citadel. Once at the bottom of the staircase, they quickly made their way down the long corridor. Lumens flickered along the strings suspending them above. The hall was wide, and the floor was wrought in iron. The sisters' boots sent clanging echoes as they made their way down the seemingly endless hallway. They stopped at a door where a servo skull keypad was embedded into the indestructible door. As Anne approached the console, the servo skull's red ocular implant clicked in word, and a red scanning light washed over her. "Access permitted," came the automated voice from a vox grill below the bone jaw. The door clicked, and the sounds of internal gears turned and banged before a rush of pocketed air rushed out into the hall, fluttering the novitiate's robes. Just as they were about to peer in, they heard hundreds of footsteps approaching from behind them. They had broken through Liv's attempted barricade.
Anne, what are we doing?
Are we holding them here? Syria asked. Anne shook her head.
No, we take shelter inside and destroy the locking mechanism. We wait for reinforcements.
Syria shook her head.
What? You would seal us in there to die of starvation? Help won't arrive for Emperor knows how long. I say we stay here and fight. I'd rather die with honor than in fear.
Anne shook her head in response and clenched her chest.
Who knows what those creatures will do to us? They want us alive, and that can only mean one thing, sister. Now get into the armory. If they breach, then we can make our stand. Until then, we survive as long as we can. We will seek the Emperor's guidance. If we pray hard enough, perhaps he will send someone to our aid, Anne said. The novitiates already began piling into the room. It was dimly lit, and the flickering blue light surrounding suspended tombs encased in stasis fields cast ominous shadows throughout the small space. The Alpha Legion was drawing closer, and Anne decided talking would not motivate her to do as she was told. Anne grabbed Syria by her collar and shoved her into the room. Liv had been watching Anne struggle with her sister. In one final noble act, once Anne had managed to get her sister into the room, Liv quickly shut the massive door. As it came within an inch of closing, Anne took notice and screamed, Liv? No! Make safe the relics. That's your job. Thanks for giving me the extra few minutes, Annie. I'll try to buy you some more time. Take care of your girls, eh?
She said, through bloodshot eyes. The door came to a grinding halt, and gears turned once again, and a loud clang rang from the thick interior as it locked. They were sealed in.
Liv, no!
Anne screamed, slamming her ceramite gauntlets into the adamantium door. With hardly enough light to see only a few paces in front of them, Anne searched for a lamp or switch to illuminate the room. She felt lightheaded and needed to brace herself before she fainted. Syria held her and kept her from tumbling to the floor.
Sister, you must get to your feet, Syria demanded. Everyone is gone. They're all dead. What use is there? Forgive me, Syria. Forgive me in my weakness,
Anne begged, stifling a cry of sorrow. The novitiates mumbled amongst each other while some searched for a light source. Syria gritted her teeth in either frustration or determination, and could not discern which from her expression.
You are not weak. You have the Emperor's strength in you, the same as I do, the same as those who laid down their lives to allow us safe passage here. We must continue to be strong, if not for the Master of Mankind, then at least do it for those who have fallen. Do it for Liv, Syria said.
Newfound fervor took hold of Anne. The faint luminescent glow from the stasis cubes, holding various rare books and items, hummed on a bench in front of her. One book in particular drew her attention. The cover of it was a putrid flesh color, and a glowing blue orb shaped like an eye was embedded in its center. Wisps of blue energy coruscated along its hard edges. Just looking at the tome was enough to cause bouts of anxiety within her. Alarmingly, a hovering servo skull hovered into view, and a red scanning beam flickered over Anne. A mechanical report came from the Vox grill where the skeletal mouth should have been. Clearance level vermilion. And with that, the hard-mounted lumens blinked to life and bathed the women in a harsh white light. Before Anna could absorb her surroundings, she heard something on the other side of the door.
How do we enter this hold, mortal?
The voices were muffled and difficult to discern, but Anna was still able to hear.
I'm afraid I don't know,
came Liv's replies. There was a low growl and heavy footfalls approached the door, presumably where Liv was standing.
She speaks the truth,
a deep hissing snarl responded.
What would you like us to do with this one? Another asked.
Bring her to the altar. This one is a rare treat. Strong souls are nigh impossible to find these days.
Anne cupped her mouth in horror. If she knew correctly, and if what veterans of the numerous battles against the worshippers of chaos were to be believed, what lay in store for Liv was not good. Anne's heart sank in the deep corner of her chest, and she gasped for air. This was her fault. If she had died in that crossfire instead of racing to her and accompanying her down in the massive steel grave, she would have died quickly. Now she may suffer immeasurably, and for days at that. She wished there was something she could do. Deep down she begged the Emperor to guide her. She willed his attention at the fullest extent of her core.
Master of mankind, hear me. Please, we are but faithful servants, your sword and shield against the evils of this galaxy. Never have I asked you for anything. Please, I beg you, deliver us, she muttered, holding her chained Aquila in her gauntlets. A sudden chill entered the room, and a misty vapor left her lips as she exhaled. The novitiates froze in place, like statues in a museum, and the light began to pale in a light blue haze. Her focus faltered, and all she could do now, and see, in front of her, in the center of the novitiates, was a robed figure.
He cannot hear you, child. He is a false god. But there are those that are real. Yes, and they do indeed hear your pleas,
the creature in the robes explained. Anne began to shiver, her teeth rattling as she tried to speak. The robed thing held out a long, pale arm, wrapped in bulging veins.
Change is the only way, Anne. For a woman of your stature, I know that is no small feat. It would be a true testament to all of your beliefs that these preachers and liars stuffed down your throat since childhood. Change can lift the burdens of your false beliefs and illuminate you in the greater truth,
the thing said, its voice whispering and rasping. It took a step, or rather moved forward toward Anne, as though her legs did not move at all. The head under the dark velvet blue hood lifted, and glimmering gold orbs hovered in the void that consumed it.
What are you?
Anne asked, her grip tightening around her necklace. The creature chuckled. Its rattling laugh reverberated from the walls around her and seemed to enter her mind. Anne tried to move but could not. Something primordial or invisible held her there, stiff and locked into place. She desperately attempted to push her arm down to her holstered bolt pistol, but only managed to roll a strained bead of sweat down her forehead.
I am the host. I am you and you are me. You are the one who can decide the fate of this shrine world. You may choose to fight and die in the most unimaginable way possible, along with precious Syria here. Oh, what a resilient soul she is. More so than you, wouldn't you say? Perhaps your emperor would listen to her instead of you. At least your sister actually believes him to be as powerful as the rest of you are told he is. Admit it. You're a fraud, Anne. Admit it and embrace it. Change. Do not pretend to be someone you surely are not.
Blasphemy! You are a demon, a creature of the warp. Your lies and tricks will not shake my resolve, for
Anne fumbled. Even as she said the words, she knew deep in her core that she did not believe them. She gritted her teeth and held back a sob. Her fists were tight, and she once again attempted to move but could not. The creature chuckled, then slowly moved over to Syria. Its elongated hand slid from the oversized cuffs of the robes, and long, taloned fingers slid through Syria's hair. The creature caressed her scalp, then turned its concealed face to Anne again.
She cannot hear you, child, so don't bother pretending to be strong for her.
There was a long, wet sigh before the creature spoke again.
I will give you a choice, child. You can stay in here, protected for a time, but you have no food, no drink. Within a week or two, you and your sisters will become starved. You will die a week or two later through sheer hunger, while two of your sisters will resort to cannibalism. Even then, they will still die. Or you can open this door, give the Dark Apostle what he needs, and be granted passage from this place. You and your sister.
Anne's heart skipped, and without hesitation, she said,
What guarantees do I have? How would I know you're not lying? Anne asked. And what of the novitiates?
The creature suddenly dispelled, and its body was gone, leaving in its wake a murky cloud of blue, glittering smoke. She noticed one of the stasis tubes was now empty. The blue book was gone. She realized she was able to move now, as painful as it was. Her sisters were still stiff and unmoving. She rubbed her arms to try and warm them. The cold in the room was becoming unbearable, She glanced around the room. It was as though she was in a time vacuum, if she even fully understood what that was. She had fought countless Xenos in her time as a sister of battle, and heard countless stories from other veteran battle sisters about a race of Xenos that could manipulate time and space, freezing their surroundings and locking captors in their place. Perhaps this was similar. "Anne?" her sister called out to her. When Anne blinked, it was as though no time had passed at all. Syria reached out and touched Anne's face and drew back, shocked. "Your skin is cold to the touch. What ails you?" Anne tried to conjure the words to explain what had just happened. To think she had just suffered a hallucination would be ludicrous. Her skin being as cold as it was certainly would testify against that theory. A demon," she said, her purple lips quivering. "Demon? What demon, sister? We saw no demons here," Syria explained, her eyes checking over her sister. When Syria's gaze went down to her hands, she gasped. Anne met her shock and looked down as well. In her hands was not the holy Aquila she thought she was clutching. It was the book. "Anne, why are you holding that?" her sister asked. Anne did not have an answer for her. She didn't know what to say or how to say it. She decided to try. "A demon came to me, told me that the only way out of this place was to open the door and give the Chaos Worshippers what they wanted. It told me that if I do this, you and I will be granted passage from this place." Syria gave a look of confusion. The confusion slowly progressed to concern. Her sister reached for the tome, but Anne pulled it away like a feral animal withholding its kill. "You don't understand, sister. Your life is the only thing I care about here." "Damn you, Anne!" "The novitiates will hear you. You're acting the way I have always feared you would." "Perhaps the sisters had been right all along," Syria said, her face swollen with rage. "What do you mean? Right about what?" Anne asked defensively. Syria looked back at the praying novitiates. They were huddled in a circle and were knelt in front of a shrine of St. Sylvana. Most of them had streams of tears, creating clean rivers across their grimy skin. They were horrified, and rightly so. "They wanted to dispel you, take away your right as a sororita. They wanted to—" "How would a novitiate like yourself know such a thing?" Anne asked. "How would I not? Your name has reached all of Ophist Prime. Every sister knows of your questionable resolve, your questionable faith. And with you saying that you're willing to strike deals with the creatures of the warp to save your own skin just proves—" "I'm doing it for you, sister. The Emperor dismisses our prayers. He shies away from our pleas. He allows our sisters, our friends, our loved ones to perish. And for what? And how many times has he intervened?" she screamed. Syria wanted to speak, but it was obvious she was too angry to construct a response. The novitiates had turned from their circle to eavesdrop on Anne and her sister. Syria threw a finger at the now glowing book. Fluorescent blue wisps of smoke rolled from the pleated cover of the book now. "This is what they want, you say?" Sirius asked. "Aye, this book," Anne replied, hoping she was finally coming to her senses. "Then we must destroy it," Sirius said. The novitiates began to gather behind Syria, their faces a blend of confusion and fear. A few of the recruits glared at Anne. Had they heard the heresy that Anne was speaking earlier? From where she stood, Anne could see that the novitiates had banded to Syria. Their blind faith in the Emperor was obvious. The fact that their determination and zealotry was far superior to hers made her feel concerned. Would her sister harm her? She had hoped not, but these were trying times. Desperate times. "No. This is our only bargaining for safe passage," Anne said. "What if they take the book and slaughter us all the same?" one of the women asked. "That is precisely what they will do." "We must do what we can now and destroy the book," another said. "How do we know that it's the book that they want? I thought Sister Melissa wanted us to protect the artifacts." "Well, we can't protect them when we're all dead, can we?" another one chimed. Anne could see she would be overruled. For a horrible moment, she wondered if she could kill them all before they could fight back. If they were dead, she could bargain with the heretics outside of the airtight blast door. Syria would never forgive her, of course, and who knew then what she might do. Syria may have been her sister, but she was everything the Imperium stood for, deep in her core. Anne felt that even though they were flesh and blood sisters, Syria would make Anne pay dearly if she executed the initiates. "Anne, what's with you? Have you heard a word we've said?" Syria asked. Anne felt as though she were in a trance. The only thing she could seem to focus on was the tome. To her surprise, it was no longer in her hands, but in the stasis field once again. How had it got there? She needed to get that book back. It was the only salvation they had. A dark vortex in her vision began to enclose around her. Bright, translucent tendrils started to protrude from the leather covers of the book as she drew closer.
Yes,
a voice hissed in her mind.
Take it.
A young red-haired novitiate stood in front of the display in a futile attempt to thwart her. She put her hands up as though to make peace with her.
Please, Sister Superior, we need to,
she started. Anne aggressively pushed her aside and deactivated the stasis field. She took the old book in her hands. The glowing blue tendrils coiled around her wrists, and she felt a warm, almost tingling sensation vibrate gently through her bloodstream from her arms up to her flushed face.
Change it. Turn it to ash and absorb its knowledge,
the voice beckoned. Muffled protests droned all around her, and she paid no heed. Syria took her arm and pulled it aside, forcing Anne to drop the ancient book to the floor. As it landed, her vision cleared and her hearing became audible again.
What are you doing, sister?
Syria asked. Anne looked down at the pages inlaid in flecked gold print on seemingly leathery, almost skin-like pages. Unreadable symbols and runes lined the pages, and drawn images of contorted abominations sent a chill down her spine. The longer she looked at the relic, the faster her visions once again became distorted, and the tendrils began to reach out to her again. It wanted her. It wanted her to change it from its current form into ash.
Change brings great power,
the voice of the host called out. A resounding boom rocked the sororitas to the ground as the plasteel door was struck by what sounded like a melta-charge. Divots protruded from the bulging door. The sounds of mag-locking demolition charges reverberated dully from the other side. Perhaps they weren't as safe as they had initially thought. They needed to do something. Now. Syria checked the mag on her bolt pistol and made her way to the other side of the room. She began pulling shelves and tables and used them as a makeshift barricade in preparation of the inevitable breach. It was pointless, Anne thought. They would come and they would slaughter them within milliseconds, and the sisters wouldn't inflict more than a scratch. They were a squad of new recruits. What could they do against thousand-year veterans of the Long War? Another detonation blew a small hole, and shrapnel from the dislodged door ripped through the throat of a novitiate like a bullet. Molten steel poured through the hole and caused phosphorus reactions on the adamantium flooring. White-hot flames burned as bright as weld arcs beside Anne. Syria tried to stop the bleeding of the novitiate's throat wound, but was unable to do so. All she could do was hold her as she gargled on her own blood, attempting in vain to speak. The dying girl clutched her rosarius, and her crystalline blue eyes blazed in desperation, her lips speckled with coughed-up blood. The other sisters were weeping at the sight. They had not been around a conflict before, and absorbing this amount of violence could break anyone. Anne looked down at the book, then back at the river of molten steel cascading down the nearly unhinged door. She took a breath, then retrieved the ominous book and placed it into the fire. Within seconds, it was aflame. A pall of white smoke immediately went into Anne's mouth as though she were a vortex and was inhaling it. Her body suddenly contorted, and she felt her muscles stretch beyond their threshold, and she screamed. The smoke continued to pour in. Her arms flew open as though she were preparing an embrace, and her bones popped as she felt them begin to reset. The pain was beyond words. She screamed so hard that her vocal cords just stopped working. She felt her jaw dislocate and shift. Her vision began to blur, and ropes of pain coiled around her body like a new torturous nervous system webbing its way around her and pulling her out so violently that she thought her entire being would become shredded atoms. Syria was bellowing as she watched her sister mutate before her eyes. Her once rosy complexion changed to a dull gray, and her mouth was pulled so wide that she looked like a bird opening its beak to sing its morning songs. Her fingers stretched, the skin on the tips tearing to make way for the growth. Blood sprinkled from her new extremities for a moment before her newly grown skin quickly repaired the open wound. After what seemed like hours of crippling pain, it was finally over. She slumped to her knees and struggled for air. Her mouth hung open, wide and round. The door behind her exploded in a flurry of metal and flames, sending another torrent of shrapnel into the room, destroying ammunition crates and weapon racks strewn about the armory. A 5-man squad of heretic space marines thudded into the chamber, their old stalker bolters poised at the sororitas. Syria fired a shot, but it went wide, clipping a skull fetish that was tied to one of the Alpha Legionnaire's pauldrons and blowing it apart. The Space Marine lunged for her and grabbed hold of her wrist, then simply squeezed. A disturbing cracking of bones was followed up with serious shouts of pain as the pistol fell from her forced open hand. The other novitiates held each other in a huddle. They prayed amongst themselves, their eyes forced shut, as though to suggest that if they couldn't see their would-be executors, perhaps they wouldn't see them back. Obviously, this would not be the case. Is this it, then? Is this the pride of the Emperor? A squad of girls crying to the corpse god for aid? Almost a pity to waste the energy to kill them, the heretic said through a crackling vox.
There will be no killing,
came a dark, foreboding voice from behind the squad. It was the leader, the one who wanted them for prisoners. Now that he was close enough to see clearly, Anne could see his mask was that of a bird. Its beak was black, and gold-flaked feathers lined the headpiece and circled down around the leader's neck like a mane. His power armor was covered in a silky yet tattered and war-torn blue robe. He bore a staff in his exposed hand. Black talons wrapped the hilt, and the bust of a torso decorated the top of the black iron-wrought staff.
I am Althix, the All-Knowing, he said. The great conspirator's children told me you would be here, host Anne.
Anne tried to speak, but the changes wrought upon her body made it nearly impossible.
No need to speak. I know of the arrangement you have made, and will honor it, he said maliciously.
She could somehow feel the smile behind his mask.
Passage? She gargled.
Ah, yes. Passage from this place. You and your dear sister. Brothers, take them, he ordered.
Where?
Anne rasped, reaching for her throat as though she could somehow claw out the blockage she could feel deep in the bottom of her neck.
Why, to the altar, of course.
The demon promised, she asked.
The Alpha Legion Space Marines took hold of Syria and 4 others. The rest of the novitiates vibrated in fear in the corner of the room. What of the rest? A legionnaire asked. The one who called himself Althix turned to face the cowering sororitas. He held out his mangled hand in a halting stature. A pungent smell of ozone filled the room, and within moments, the remaining cluster of women started to shriek. Their skin burst into blue flames, and their eyeballs popped into puffs of steam. Sizzling grease from melting skin, and their tongues hissed and popped as their bodies dissolved beneath their pure white robes. As quickly as it began, it was over. The girls were dead, changed from young, aspiring warriors of the Emperor to nothing more than blackened bones. Back on the surface in the courtyard in front of the burning citadel, an altar of rusted steel had been assembled. Bloody chains rattled in the smoke-filled air, and banners of the Hydra and thorny cogs swayed over the gore-covered altar.
I was promised,
Anne begged as she was dragged by her arm toward the altar.
And the promise has been fulfilled. You have been granted passage from the armory, and you have given me what I desire. Well, I wanted the contents in the holy texts, but the contents now reside in you. However, the outcome remains unchanged. I still shall achieve what is owed to me,
Althix explained. Horribly disfigured and mutated cultists stood assembled at the front of the altar and the grand catwalk that ascended to the ritual gate's circular platform. One of the cultists was draped in a magnificent blue robe and donned a beaked helmet, much like Althix. She was holding a folded set of clothing in her bone-thin arms. Small feathers had begun to push their way from her skin, and a ghoulish gray had washed over her. Anne was not much different in appearance now. Whatever had happened to her in the armory after she burned the book and involuntarily inhaled the warp-fused smoke had caused her to change.
Sister, what are you talking about? What promise? Has this been a scheme all along? Are you the one who orchestrated this attack?
Syria accused, becoming enraged.
This day has been envisioned and planned for decades, naive one. Destiny has brought us all here. It is the great conspirator's way.
What will you?
Anne started, feeling her veins start to throb throughout her limbs. Anne's pain was so excruciating that she could barely breathe.
What will we do with you and your sisters? I think you already know the answer to that, my dear, he said, waving forward the mangled gray woman.
She unfurled the clothing in her arms and displayed yet another set of blue robes, adorned in shimmering gold-colored eyes stitched into the material. They were like runes drawn upon a canvas. 2 more cultists approached Anne and roughly removed her already dislodged battle plate. Her transformation had pushed apart the seams and latches holding her armor together to her body, and the process took only a moment. Now that she was down to her body glove, the female cultist put the robes onto her. They were cool to the touch and heavy. She noticed none of the others were receiving the same treatment, and had been led up the 20-foot-high catwalk to the altar's main platform. Anne squinted through her new eyes to focus on what she thought at first was smoldering wood or metal on the altar above. Her eyes felt oversized, and as she squinted, her eyelids felt as though they closed from the outer corners and came into her nose. She couldn't reach up to touch them, to feel, considering a space marine was holding her wrists in one tightly clasped grip. The Goliath warp portal began to hum, causing vibrations in the cracked stone under Anne's feet. A milky swirl of ethereal energy rippled in the circular archway behind the sororitas that were brutally wrapped in rusty chains and connected to supports on the colossal platform. The women were rapturous in their prayers, begging the absent god emperor for his help. Anne was able to force out a cry.
I was promised passage, my sister and I.
And here you are, sister. You have been granted passage from the armory to the open space of the surface. However, you have not been faithful in the agreement yourself. The relic we seek was destroyed, so I believe that a compromise must be made. I have compromised by allowing you up here, and in return, I will take the power of the relic from you, since you have absorbed its power instead of handing me the book,
Althix explained, annoyed. Using the last grain of courage she had remaining, she looked up to the apostle.
Please, take me, and allow my sister's mercy,
Anne begged.
Oh, I think I'll take all of your souls. Do not pretend to be courageous, coward,
he snapped. The energies whirling behind the sisters began to shift into a medley of bright colors, from rich purples to brilliant blues. Starlight and golden rays of ethereal energy poured over the restrained sisters, and it was not the golden light of the Emperor. It was from something far more sinister. Much like in the armory, the sisters began to dissolve beneath their robes. The screams were unlike anything Anne had ever heard before. Her new skin quivered at the sound, and guilt ran through her new veins. The sound seemed amplified, and she could almost feel their combined pain, and she writhed and flailed in the unbreakable grip of her captors. She wished she had done things differently. Regrets ran rampant through her mind. She wept as she watched Syria fall to her knees, her head a blackened skull of roiling steam pouring from her empty eye sockets and gaping maw. Her body slumped over and became a rictus statue of fried muscle tissue and melted armor, holding her idol next to her battle sisters. Anne felt the wax curtains that were now her eyelids close over the deformed eyeballs, and the scene became a faded image. She thought about her friends, Asteran and Liv. She saw their eyes, their abhorrent horror of what she had done and what she had become. She saw her sister's fury burning to her very soul at the disappointment of the choice she had made. She wished the traitorous Marines would execute her. She wished so hard that she could have done everything differently from the moment she opened her eyes this morning, assuming it would be just another typical day on Ophis Prime, where she would awaken in her billet, head to the training facility to practice her shooting, then meet with her friends at the hall for the meeting she had been missing. She would tell everyone of the impending doom. She would embrace Astran and apologize for missing their meetings. She would tell him how much she regarded him as her best friend. She let out a long sigh in anticipation of what was to come. As she did, the battle sounds of the city slowly fell to a light hum. She could hear her breaths deep in her chest and the pulsing of her heart in her temples. Her vision began to darken to a deep, dark place as she listened to the new sounds around her. Her back was relaxed against soft cushions, her head resting on a comfortable pillow. She could hear her sisters outside speaking about the daily objectives and how important it was to not be late to meet their canoness for her training session. A dark sheet lifted from her eyes, and she could see the flickering fluorescent lumen above her. It was bright, and she raised a hand to block it from her vision, since she didn't seem to have the ability to completely close off her vision. As she did, the bulbs burst in a shower of glass onto her. She flinched awkwardly and rose from her laying position and let her feet down from where she was sitting. She was sitting on a bed. How was she sitting on a bed and not kneeling before a squad of heretic Astartes? How had she gotten here? Was everything she had just experienced a dream? A trick of the mind? She got to her feet and made her way for the light switch near the billet's exit door. When she did, the lamp she had set up along her steel countertops flickered to life. Once her vision focused and she could see clearly that she was indeed back in her room, she quickly made her way to the latrine. In the mirror's reflection, she saw a hideous stranger. She gasped and almost swung her fist into it. Her skin was a ghoulish gray and her eyes were reptilian. Golden yellow orbs had replaced her once beautiful blue eyes, and her pupils were now a linear ink blot in place of the natural circular ones she used to have.
How is this possible? What blasphemy is this?
She whispered, a shimmering tear swelling in the corner of her alien orbits. If she were to be seen in this state, her sisters would not hesitate to shoot her on sight. It was the sororitas' way. Suffer not the alien to live. And she certainly looked alien. How was all this able to transpire? She looked at a data slate that rested on her nightstand. It was dated 4 days earlier than she recalled the date being. She was confused. She did not normally keep old data slates. She had to confirm the date. There was an old easel in her living quarters where she had listed her daily objectives and secondaries. She always dated them. When she came to the room, she saw the date matched the slate. Her misshapen mouth fell open in awe.
Can't be,
she whispered. She closed her eyes and listened. There were no explosions in the streets outside her billet window. No gunshots. No screams of death and suffering. In fact, everything was as it was only a few days ago, the orbital station cresting the upper atmosphere just visible above the orange-hued skyline. She had gone back. Witchery, she whispered again, hoping no one could hear. If it were true, if she indeed had gone back 4 days' time, this left her with an opportunity to change the coming storm. As important as the knowledge was, she also knew that it would be her death if she were to confront anyone with this. Who could she turn to for aid in this horrific state and in this moment? Who would possibly give her a chance to explain the happenings that were to come and what would happen to her? There was only one place she knew she could go to speak to someone that wouldn't shoot her the first moment they laid eyes on her, and getting there would be a feat in itself. Concealed beneath the blue robes adorned by the Alpha Legion cultists, Anne had made it somehow completely undetected to the old ruined building where the weekly group gatherings had been taking place. She sat in the empty administratum area in the dark. She could see everything. Her horrible mutations acted as much as a gift as they were a curse. She could see vivid details, the very microdust particles fluttering in the dead air of the abandoned Hab building. She could hear the monotone conversations of the civilians on the streets outside. She could feel every fiber in her being absorbing anything and everything around her, feeding her infinite knowledge of what was and what would be. The next moment, Anne knew it would come. Her heart fluttered, and dread took hold. She fought back the urge to run to the door, to start apologizing and begging for forgiveness, but her better judgment kept her from doing so. The door to the hall opened, and an Imperial soldier stepped inside, her build stocky yet still feminine. The unforgettable face of Anne's friend illuminated by the dim glow of the lumens above as she stepped forward. Anne realized too late that she had leaned around the doorway of the empty room she hid inside, exposing her cowled head. Liv had taken notice immediately. "Who's there?" Liv asked, hesitating to move any closer. Anne tried to think quickly. She did not want to risk her reacting hastily.
I'm new here,
she spoke, her voice raspy and strained. Liv smiled. "It's all right. We welcome newcomers. Come, it's all right. We took our oaths to keep our gathering secret, remember?" Liv asked, holding out her hand. Anne awkwardly stepped out and approached Liv, keeping her face hidden from the light. She reached out her long, veiny arm and took Liv's hand. "I'm Liv. Pleasure to meet you. And you are?"
Anne paused.
If you want to remain anonymous, I understand. We all do. It's perfectly safe, though, you know. We even have a space marine who attends these meetings, if that means anything to you. If you won't tell me your name, what would you like me to call you?" she asked kindly.
Anne looked at the floor, then slowly raised up her head just high enough so Liv couldn't see her disfigurements.
You can call me the host.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program. Lols. Hope you liked it.